My name is Peter Rosset, and I'm a faculty member or professor at El Colegio de la Frontera Sur, ECOSUR, in Mexico. Also a visiting professor at Thammasat University here in Thailand, and I'm a staff member of La Via Campesina, Mexico. I think that we have a global problem of the expansion of monoculture, and I think the monoculture is linked to agribusiness. And one of the largest, but not the only causes is the livestock industrial complex. And by having livestock in confined operations where you have massive numbers of chicken or pigs or cows together, then you need vast areas to produce the feed for those animals, and those monocultures to produce animal feed of different kinds of grains, whether it be soybeans in South America or whether it be maize in Southeast Asia, then are one of the drivers of the expansion of monoculture, deforestation, and a lot of other related problems. Of course, those are not the only monocultures. There are also monocultures of all of the other food and fiber crops that we get from agribusiness, but I use the livestock feed as one of the fastest growing areas of monoculture and industrial agriculture. We have a nexus of problems right now that are related to the expansion of monoculture, particularly but not only for livestock feed. Amongst those problems are climate change, but we also have problems of massive displacement of peasant and indigenous peoples' populations from rural areas. We also have problems of the emergence of new diseases, and so we have a nexus of problems. The way that this works, for example, is that the expansion of monoculture to feed livestock drives the cutting of the forest, whether it's the cutting of the forest, for example, in the case of South America, by agribusiness itself to expand agribusiness owned and planted and controlled monoculture, or whether it's inducing small holders into changing their cropping patterns from complex, diverse peasant agriculture into monoculture to sell to livestock feed companies, as is the case with the maize monoculture boom in Southeast Asia. One way or another, it's driving the expansion of monoculture, it's driving the cutting of forest. So amongst the major causes of greenhouse gas emissions are forest clearing, and so this monoculture is driving forest clearing. Also confined livestock, they have a lot of emissions coming from the manure accumulation. If you have livestock that are, for example, with small farmers that are spread out, are diverse, dispersed areas that are feeding on natural pasture, then their manure gets incorporated into the soil, is fertilizer for the pasture, for the other plant species that grow there. But when the livestock are confined with thousands of animals in a small area, then you get the manure accumulating in one place, contaminating waterways and emitting lots of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this particular set of problems driving climate change are also driving new diseases. So many of the diseases that we've faced in epidemic or pandemic proportions, whether it's swine flu or avian flu or E. coli outbreaks or salmonella outbreaks, a lot of them are related to this livestock, this confined livestock production. One way is that the animals are getting sick because they're overcrowded, they're being fed with antibiotics, with hormones, they're passing diseases, new diseases are breeding, emerging from those livestock operations. But the other is the cutting of the forest, because as forest areas are cut, then wildlife, which lives in the forest, comes closer and closer into the remaining forest around human habitation, and there's much more chance of livestock, of wild animals, whether it's bats or other kinds of animals, coming into contact with the human population and diseases jumping over. So for example, if we look at COVID, all of the major scientific hypotheses on the COVID origin have to do with the livestock or livestock feed industry. Either one hypothesis, it's because of forest clearing, smaller and smaller forests and the wildlife in contact with people, or it's because so-called wild meat was sold in so-called wet markets, but in fact most of that wild meat now is fed on the same livestock feed that is produced by the same companies that are producing the livestock feed for chickens and for pigs and for cows. In other words, it's exactly the same that's driving this now monetized, commercialized, confined production of so-called wild meat. And the final hypothesis is that it was a laboratory escape. But the reason why we have the danger of laboratory escape, for example, of new viruses, is that the companies that are engaged in this massive confined livestock production, they know that there's a risk that governments will ban this kind of production because it automatically leads to new diseases. So they want to get ahead of the curve, so they fund vaccine research. And the kind of vaccine research, part of the kind that they fund is called gain of function. So that means that in the lab, scientists create super powerful viruses so that they can create super powerful vaccines. And they do this so they can say to governments, you don't need to ban confined production because we're ahead of the curve, we're already developing the vaccines. The problem is if one of those super viruses escapes from the laboratory, we can have a pandemic. So at this point in time, we don't know the origin of COVID, but we can be sure that it has something to do with the livestock and livestock feed complex, whether it's research funded by them, forest clearing caused by them, or animals fed by them. And so we can see that the same driver of climate change is also driving the emergence of new diseases. And then if we look at the massive outmigration of peasant and other populations from rural areas, it's because their land is being grabbed by the same companies in order to produce that livestock feed or other monocultures. So many of the problems facing humanity, our planetary crisis, are all related to this nexus. We have to be very careful when we listen to solutions in the news media. And I can say, both as a scientist and as part of La Via Campesina, the global peasant movement, that literally almost every solution that we hear coming out of the mouth of any politician, whether it's Biden or whether it's governments in the global South, is a false solution, is a lie in terms of really addressing the causes of climate change. So we're facing right now a wave of green capitalism, the green economy, in which things like land grabbing and land degradation are being justified under the so-called solutions to climate change. The problem is that when we have international climate negotiations like the COP, where governments meet to supposedly address climate change, in reality what they're doing is they're meeting with the private sector, with global corporations, and they're trafficking in false solutions. False solutions to climate change, but which generate new profit opportunities for these companies. So some of these examples are so-called renewable energy. For example, agrofuels, which will cut down huge areas of forest to grow monoculture to be turned into either alcohol or biodiesel, but in fact end up using more energy and emitting more into the atmosphere than using petroleum. So they're a false solution, but they generate enormous profit-making opportunities and huge displacement of rural peasant and indigenous peoples' populations. Other kinds of renewable energies like aeolic energy, wind farms are very unproductive of energy, but destroy the environment. The same with solar panel plantations, the same with large hydroelectric dams. So the whole area of renewable energy has to be questioned. There's no such thing as free energy in climate terms. The only way to address the energy contribution to climate change is to use less energy. There's no way around that, and so all of these other solutions in one way or another end up being false solutions. Then we have the forest cover commitments under these negotiations where governments, for example, say, we commit to increasing forest cover to 30% of our land area or 40% of our land area. What does that mean? They look at traditional peasant, indigenous people population who live in the forest people who in fact take care of the forest, that have been taking care of the forest for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They're now accused of degrading the forest under redrawn forest boundaries. They are evicted from their ancestral homeland, and that land is then given as a concession, oftentimes to foreign forestry companies, to plant a forest monoculture. Now, a forest monoculture is not a forest in ecological sense, and I think if anybody reflects on it, they'll realize that that's not a forest. A forest monoculture of commercial timber species, so that the company who receives the concession can first make money from carbon credits. This is a whole carbon credit thing is a fake solution. And then, of course, make money from the timber itself, Meanwhile, the people who lived in the forest before have lost their livelihood, their territory, and the forest no longer exists because, in fact, they weren't degrading the forest, they were taking care of the forest. Another fake solution has to do with companies declaring themselves net zero. First of all, net zero wouldn't be good enough. We have to reduce emissions, but the way they get to this so-called net zero, for example, here we're in Thailand right now, we just heard of a case of one of the major agribusiness companies based here in Thailand grabbing the land of peasants so that they could plant forest monoculture to claim carbon sequestration to offset the rest of their operation, which is amazingly, incredibly polluting and emitting of greenhouse gas emissions. So basically this so-called net zero means that they increase their emissions, making climate change worse and worse and worse, and drive more and more people off of their land through fake offsetting solutions, because a forestry monoculture in no way has the carbon sequestration ability of either a so-called natural forest or a natural forest managed by indigenous people. So I think to summarize what I would say, that rather than solving climate change, what we're seeing is that the face of capitalist expansion in the countryside worldwide now is a green face. It's business as usual, capitalism, profit-taking, evicting of local population, and all of this is justified by so-called climate commitments. Then we can ask, what would the real solutions be? The real solutions are what, for example, Via Campesina calls food sovereignty. And food sovereignty means, instead of having a globalized food economy where nobody eats what's produced in their own country, but everything is flown around the world, shipped around the world. In the US, they're going to eat what's produced in Peru. In Peru, they're going to eat what's produced in the US. All of that shipping, long-distance transport is emitting greenhouse gas emissions. All of the production is industrial agriculture, more greenhouse gas emissions. If instead we had a more localized food economy where people in Peru ate what Peruvian farmers produce, people in the US ate what US farmers produce, and around the world, in that sense, then we would reduce drastically the amount of greenhouse gas emissions coming from the food system. And then if that food that they produce in their own country, instead of being produced by industrial monoculture by large national food companies, were produced by peasant and family farmers using agroecological production practices, then the actual emissions that come from the farming itself would be dramatically reduced, or even would be negative emissions, because agroecological farming actually it sequesters carbon from the atmosphere into the soil. So food sovereignty, which means respecting the right of rural people to their traditional livelihood, which is producing food for local populations, is also the way to address climate change. And it's also the way to stop this emergence of new diseases, because the new diseases like COVID and others, they're coming from the expansion of monoculture. The alternative to the expansion of monoculture is agrarian reform, putting land back into the hands of small farmers, peasants, indigenous people in a relocalized food system that social movements call food sovereignty. And so these kind of solutions, the real solutions to the planetary crisis, to the civilizational crisis, are actually coming from the movements of rural people themselves. So what we need to do as a society is listen. What are peasant movements saying? What are indigenous peoples movements saying? How do they have in their hands potential real solutions instead of the false solutions and the trafficking in false solutions that we're getting between governments and the private sector? Well, if we're talking about the expansion of industrial monoculture under the control of giant agribusiness corporations, we're talking about politics also, because these companies become so powerful and so wealthy that they're more powerful than governments, and they basically buy government regulators, they buy politicians, they buy senators, they buy agriculture ministers around the country. And I can say absolutely for sure, as somebody who with Via Campesina has worked in dozens of countries around the world, that with very few exceptions, all of the ministries of agriculture, many of the ministries of the environment, many of the ministries of health, in those countries that have ministries related to the food supply, they're basically in the employ of these same companies. So these, by allowing monopoly and by allowing these corporate monopolies to become so large and global, global, then they become impossible to control. And so I would say that we have, on the political side, that is related to authoritarian governments. You have giant monopolies that control governments, that want governments to act in their interests instead of the interests of the people. You have people not happy with that, protesting with that, and so that favors the more and more authoritarian government. And so we have to break this link between these growing corporate monopolies, which are in the food system, not only in the food system, but in the food system and government. And the only way to do that is by breaking up the monopolies. In fact, most countries in the world have very good anti-monopoly legislation, but very few governments actually implement it because of the corporate money in politics that corrupts the ability and erodes the ability of governments to actually regulate those companies. But we won't be able to break this rise of authoritarianism if we're not able to break monopoly capital and these giant global monopoly corporations.